wasn't the plan.
It was a spontaneous, creative decision made after years of careful research.
Being really old and almost dying a bunch doesn't count as research.
Almost dying is the best way to learn how not to die. Besides, it worked, didn't it?
Much is being made about the PlayStation brand's games-as-a-service meltdown, reasonably and understandably so. How could Sony botch this initiative so badly, so publicly, so completely? But I think something really important is being buried in this story, overlooked at best, or talked down at worst. And that's that, regardless of the failure and execution, going after games-as-a-service success is a good thing, actually. Trying to make multiple winners in the space is smart, actually. Mid and long-term monetary success absolutely runs through these games, actually. And if you care about PlayStation's long-term health, you better not ignore the necessity of succeeding outside of the AAA single-player realm. Find success or die trying. Those are the only two directions to go in. If you're blissfully unaware of what I'm even talking about, lucky you, let me catch you up. Sony, PlayStation's megalithic Japanese parent company, is heavily reliant on the PlayStation brand to drive revenue and profit alike. To illustrate the point, merely look at Sony's Q2 2024 financials, released in November of last year, just a few months ago. PlayStation, known internally as the Games and Network Services silo, accounted for more revenue than Sony's behemoth music and movies and television divisions combined, with plenty of room to spare. PlayStation's operating income is likewise substantially larger than any other part of Sony. We won't get into the deep financial weeds any further here, other than to say that it's vitally important to Sony that PlayStation doesn't just operate well, but continues to extract maximal value. Should that begin to slip, the cascading effect around the company could be drastic. Hell, now retired ex-Sony exec Shuhei Yoshida recounted on a recent podcast that PlayStation 3's initial failure, and the substantial financial losses Sony incurred because of it, could have shut the entire brand down completely, and it was only Sony's TV manufacturing that helped stem the bleeding.
When I was talking with Ken, and Ken explained the business model of sales processor, he said we're gonna build as big a new business outside the video game. Otherwise, we won't be able to recoup the investment. So I thought, we would be over. We are over.
Remember, Sony isn't Microsoft, nor is it Nintendo. Xbox was arguably Microsoft's least important internal silo for many years, with the division's P&L largely irrelevant to the larger corporate entity, at least until they bought Activision and went all in as a third-party games publisher, while Nintendo is a games company full stop. In this regard, Sony's a bit of a unique entity, a one-time electronics company that wisely invested in content beginning in the late 80s, as it gobbled up the likes of CBS Records and Columbia Pictures and solidified Sony as something other than a gizmo manufacturer first. Their instincts here were very good.
Very good. Very good.
So all of that brings us to today. PlayStation is humming along, PlayStation 5 is selling extremely well, even outpacing the meteorically popular PlayStation 4 in time-adjusted unit sales in these United States, the biggest core gaming market in the world by a mile. Hell, tens of millions of people still play on PS4 around the world too, a machine that's entering its 12th year, and which is still manufactured, all while Sony laps its competition in entering emerging markets like China, India, and Africa, where plenty of fruit will be born. But an enormous tension has developed on the market, all revolving around how people choose to play games and how they choose to spend their money. Now, make no mistake, Sony is making staggeringly more money per user on a PlayStation console than they ever have, as illustrated by the remarkable fact that through fiscal year 2023, so more than a year ago on the calendar, PlayStation had made twice as much profit from PS5 alone than it did during the entire PS1 and PS2 generations combined. Let me repeat that. In a 4-year period on PlayStation 5, Sony netted an operating income of $10 billion from running their ecosystem. From the end of calendar year 1994, when PS1 launched in Japan, through calendar year 2005, the last year of PlayStation 2 being the marquee console in the PlayStation lineup, Sony made $5 billion in cumulative operating income from gaming over a decade. Sony is doing better with 70 million PS5s on the front line than it was with more than 100 million deployed PS4s, not to mention 150 million PS2s or 100 million PS1s, again combined. But it's how that money is filtering through to them that was undoubtedly eye-opening, and forced them to make a really wise decision, which is to pursue that source of income more aggressively. Again, let's not mix up the wisdom in the decision from the execution of that decision, and don't fall prey to the idea that console gaming is dying. It isn't. Back in the day, a la carte game sales were all that really mattered, along with some odds and ends that helped round things out, accessories like memory cards and extra controllers, licensing for things like strategy guides and toys, and so on. and all around costs were dramatically lower. As my friend David Jaffe told me on one of our many episodes of Sacred Symbols Plus, he and his small team made the original Twisted Metal on PS1 for less than $500,000, and it went on to sell a couple million copies to date. That's pure profit. Multiply that by Sony's aggressive second and third party publishing initiatives during the latter half of the 90s and through the PS2 era, and you can see how money was made and everyone stayed fed. But fast forward to today, where Sony is perhaps best known for its marquee AAA first-party single-player games. A lone high-end member of a first-party team on some of these games will cost in a year what it cost to create the original Twisted Metal full stop. And yeah, you won't sell a couple million or so like the original Twisted Metal, you might sell, say, 10 million copies of Spider-Man 2 at full price in just a few months. That's awesome, of course. 10 million copies at $70 a pop nets you an enormous $700 million in gross revenue, bolstered by Sony not having to split its storefront fees with anyone. But then you realize the game cost well over $300 million to make, some 700 times the original Twisted Metal's development cost. Yet Spider-Man 2, unadjusted for inflation, cost a mere $20 more. Adjust the values for inflation, and Twisted Metal was considerably more expensive at the point of sale relative to time, and the brand Spider-Man 2 was built around was licensed, eating a low 9 figures from the total. And you had to aggressively market it too, which likely cost another low 9 figures. The point is, before you know it, Sony might have made $100 million in profit on Spider-Man 2 if they're lucky, and yes, that's a lot of money to me and you. That's even a lot of money to some mid-tier publishers who would die for those numbers. But to a company like Sony, not really. Not when you bet so much time and money, not when the opportunity cost is so staggering. They made the same amount of profit on Twisted Metal in 1995 that they did on Spider-Man 2 in 2023, but they bet so much more on one than the other. One took less than a calendar year to make, the other took more than 5 years. One had a development team of perhaps a dozen, the other hundreds, with untold hundreds more working on it in a support and contract capacity. The economic tension here is obvious to anyone with a functioning brain. There has to be other avenues to make money on games, right? So what does Sony do? Well, the powers that be undoubtedly saw where the money was largely flowing into their coffers from, and let's be clear, it's not from their single-player games, nor is it from many other companies' single-player games either. You can't release a handful of first and second-party games a year, make no more than low 9 figures in profit on each, and make 2 and 2 equal 4. No, the profit is categorically and decisively coming from games as a service, from continuous support of older and newer products alike, from which Sony passively sits back and receives 30% of every transaction without lifting a finger. It's a pretty sweet position to be in, no doubt. Sony sells you a console, maybe breaks even or makes a few bucks on top, supports its digital ecosystem which you pay a nominal annual fee to use, and then, because you're a gigantic nerd, you purchase hundreds of dollars of, say, Fortnite skins over the course of a couple of years. Sony invested virtually nothing in you in terms of content, but you're feeding them 30% rips. And yeah, they're happy when they get their 30% of a single-player game, sure, that's awesome too, and it's 100% if it's first or second party. But that's a one-time thing, maybe executed by an average player only a few times a year at most. Not everyone is me spending a couple $1,000s a year on single-player fare. If you were like me, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But attach rate is no longer the telling statistic, especially with games so quickly, regularly, and steeply discounted after launch, but rather user engagement, daily, weekly, and monthly active users, ongoing subscriptions like PlayStation Plus, and the unavoidable Fortnites, Apex Legends, Marvel Rivals, and whatever else is of the world. Sony execs look at that 30% they receive from this passively, and they wonder, what if we became more active? This is where I want to make the case, as I already have, that the entire impetus behind their failed games as a service initiative is actually rock solid. Again, think about it from their perspective. They think, well, we invest a few $100 million into a new The Last of Us single-player game, and maybe we'll make $100 million in profit when all is said and done. We spent 5 years on this game. We made $20 million a year in profit. We can only do so many of these at a time. We only have so many resources. The margins are too small, and we need to figure something else out too. Makes perfect sense to me. One doesn't have to come at the sake of the other. Single-player gaming is still vital, no doubt. It's all I play. But the margins, you've got to go to games as a service. So that something else, as it turns out, was trying to turn those 30% rips into 100% by funding, building, and operating these games as a service themselves. This was in premise quite smart, and as we learned back in early 2022, when ex-PlayStation CEO Jim Ryan revealed that Sony would invest in 10 games as a service of their own, PlayStation intended on going all in on the idea with plenty of resources invested and bites at the apple manufactured, which is key to finding success in a crowded space where most games fail fairly spectacularly. By the middle of 2022, that number of products went from 10 to 12, and that summer, Sony spent an enormous sum, $3.6 billion, to purchase famed service game developer Bungie to help them out and make this whole thing official. To me, this is actually the core of where, how, and when things started to go wrong.
Was that wrong? Should I not have done that?
This ended up being the biggest mistake they made, which really says something, because they've made a ton of mistakes here. But needless to say, they really believed in this idea and they put their money, time, and resources into it. The timelines were aggressive, which is how you know this whole thing really went pear-shaped rather quickly. In May of 2022, Jim Ryan suggested that Sony would have a dozen games as a service offerings on the market by the end of the 2024 fiscal year, which is at the end of March 2025. That means you and I'd be playing most of these, if not all of them, as we speak. The plan changed by November of 2023, however, when Hiroki Totoki, the man who would temporarily take over for a retiring or maybe fired or perhaps both Jim Ryan, in which he said that they had planned to release 6 of these 12 games as a service by the end of their 2025 fiscal year, which is the end of March 2026 on the calendar. Now, we know the plan has been trimmed down even further. We'll get Fair games at some point from Quebec-based first-party team Haven, which Sony purchased outright for some reason. Helldivers 2 was one of them, no doubt, and Concord, oh, precious Concord, was also one. Does MLB The Show count? It's annualized, so probably not, though Sony's own infographics show they consider it a service game. Did Destiny 2 count? How about Marathon? Probably not, as Sony didn't even own Bungie at the time they made these original proclamations. What we do know from reporting and leaks alike are many of the games that were in some sort of development before being cancelled. A Spider-Man multiplayer project at Insomniac, The Last of Us Online, which was properly announced by Naughty Dog but cancelled deep into development. A shame since I know people who played it and it was apparently great. A Twisted Metal project likely envisioned to somehow come together with the Peacock TV show, apparently shuffled between 2 studios before a bullet was put into its head. The Deviation developed FPS led by Call of Duty veteran Jason Blundell, though as we've said ad nauseum for over a year on Sacred Symbols, he's now working at an unannounced first-party team at Sony, maybe on the same or similar project. A mysterious fantasy game from longtime first-party team London Studio, which, when cancelled, cost the entire squad their jobs. And the most recent additions in the form of a Ben game, which I've actually known about for a while and can confirm its existence, as well as a completely mystifying God of War multiplayer title being developed by remake specialist Bluepoint. More on that obnoxious mystery in a bit. Add to all of this the hundreds of millions of dollars Sony invested into and subsequently lost from the disaster that was Firewalk's Concord, and the entire thing is an unmitigated plane crash, with perhaps a lone bright spot in the form of Helldivers 2, which I'll get to shortly. But it didn't have to be like this. I guess that's the point I'm ultimately trying to make.
Yeah, he doesn't even get us, man. We're talking about you.
So, what went haywire? Several things, I'd say. For starters, while I think Sony obviously investing what appears to be at least a couple $1 billion into games as a service projects was a smart use of financial resources in premise, because just 1 or 2 of those games hitting as desired could make it all back and then get rolling into this new space, it's clear that the partners Sony chose were largely all wrong, if not some of the projects full stop. I mean, think about it. Sony not only spent hundreds of millions of dollars on making Concord, but it spent untold more buying the team behind it outright, thinking they were securing a valuable asset that would support their new could-be behemoth. It's bad money after bad money after bad money for years, all while being deluded enough to think otherwise. Imagine how completely out of touch you have to be to look at Concord behind the scenes and think it stood any sort of chance, especially with a sky-high budget to recoup on $40 of a la carte sales that are largely anathema to the space. But Concord has been beaten up so badly at this point, what's the point of continuing? There are other mistakes far less obvious but potentially just as costly, but it still cannot be ignored. A major thing that went wrong clearly is that at least some of Sony's decision makers have no taste and sparse industry knowledge, and it cost them huge. In the aforementioned Shuhei Yoshida interview, the former exec said something really interesting, something we actually knew from Sony's own financials in years past, but that we needed to be reminded of. The money going into these games wasn't coming from some sort of pile of cash that would have otherwise gone to single-player, more traditional PlayStation fare. Since profits were so incredibly high with PS5 from the jump compared to generations past, Yoshida noted that 2 piles of cash were created to support this new dual approach. One for the Uncharted's, Horizons, and God of Wars of the world, and the other for the more mysterious products they would launch unlike anything they ever had. So while the money lost on these various cancelled and aborted projects stings mightily, it shouldn't in premise be taking away from the single-player fare in and of itself. No, the mistake here rather, and this is the big one from me, comes from resource management and allocation, and the opportunity cost that came from having certain entities make these games. Honestly, who cares if Sony engages with new and outside studios, Haven, Firewalk, Deviation, and the like, to make this stuff? That's fine. If not entirely logical, that actually makes sense. Go find the teams that have the expertise you're looking to leverage, but that's not what they did, at least not really. Instead, they took single-player centric studios with little, no, or lapsed online experience, the likes of Naughty Dog, Bend, and London, and got them involved too. This was a gigantic mistake, again, not because of the money, but because of the time. Opportunity cost is everything. London is gone, yes, but you won't be hearing from Bend until the PlayStation 6 era, and while Naughty Dog has other things going on, hundreds of people undoubtedly spent serious 9 figures on a project that won't only ever not see the light of day, but which precluded them working on Naughty Dog's bread and butter. This is completely unforgivable resource management, and that doesn't even take into account deploying a team like Bluepoint, known specifically and only for remakes, remasters, and ports, on a God of War Online game, all to try to be cute by half and shortcut time spent working on God of War Ragnarok alongside Santa Monica into something more. It's weird enough that they were using them on God of War at all instead of contracting that work out externally and having Bluepoint do what they were supposed to be doing, which is to remake shit. Like Bend, you won't be hearing from Bluepoint until the PlayStation 6 era, all because Sony sought shortcuts to make things easier. And this is where I want to hammer another point home, because there's another shortcut. This one, the shortcut to end all shortcuts. Earlier, I noted that the Bungie acquisition was perhaps the single biggest boondoggle to come out of this situation, and indeed, I think this isn't only PlayStation's biggest mistake in the brand's 30-plus year history, but the worst purchase Sony Corporation has ever made. It also happens to be the most expensive deal Sony has ever made, unadjusted for time. Sony bought CBS Records for $2 billion in 1988, and a year later they bought Columbia Pictures for $3.4 billion. At $3.6 billion in 2022, Bungie outstrips them both, and though it seems disingenuous to not adjust for inflation, think about the core point. Sony has gotten untold billions and billions and billions of dollars in profit over the years from those two acquisitions in the late 80s alone. That was money very, very, very well spent, even for the time when it was more extreme comparable to the market. But Sony will never get a single thing out of Bungie that was worth the price of entry. As I said on Sacred Symbols at the time and endlessly since, this purchase was a major mistake, a complete waste of money, and again, trying to seek a shortcut into making something happen, in this case trying to infuse games as a service expertise into a studio and publishing family with scant experience. But there are no shortcuts, and though I've been roundly made fun of for stressing Sony's success in organic growth versus inorganic, I was totally right all along, not surprisingly. To this day, Sony has never successfully purchased a team that it didn't first work with as a second party, to prove from the embryonic state of a game until its launch that the sides could work together fruitfully. As gaming behemoth Nintendo said in a statement just a few years ago in part, quote, "Our brand was built upon products crafted with dedication by our employees, and having a large number of people who don't possess Nintendo DNA in our group would not be a plus to the company," end quote. What's obvious is that Sony saw Microsoft's acquisition of Activision, saw them overpay for the entity by an enormous amount of money, ratcheting up the pressure, and thought, what if we did the same exact thing just on a smaller scale comparable to our own footprint? Sony not only flushed $3.6 billion down the toilet in buying Bungie, but has potentially spent hundreds of millions more just keeping it going. Bungie is a complete lemon, a shadow of its former self, something Sony apparently didn't know when it bought it. It's since laid off hundreds, canceled projects, dealt with lawsuits, overseen the era of Destiny 2's decline and the splintering of its MOBA team into PlayStation Studios, and are resting all of its hopes on an extraction shooter. Listen to me well, you can kiss all of that money PlayStation spent on Bungie goodbye, and if you want to be mad at resource management in regard to single player versus multiplayer games, this is where you should be angry. Because Sony spent more on acquiring Bungie than it did acquiring the following active and defunct first-party teams combined: Bend, Big, Bluepoint, Evolution, Firesprite, Firewalk, Guerrilla, Haven, Housemarque, Incognito, Insomniac, Media Molecule, Naughty Dog, Neon Koi, Nixes, Studio Liverpool, Sucker Punch, and Zipper Interactive. There's your illustration of disastrous decisions and the downstream effect they can have. Sony could have greenlit perhaps 15 PlayStation-like AAA single-player projects of the highest caliber from first and second party for the amount they spent on Bungie. Wrap your mind around that factoid for a while. So yeah, chasing service games is a good plan in premise, but botched beyond belief in execution. The wrong money spent on the wrong projects, the wrong teams working on the wrong projects, the time wasted, the opportunity cost. Imagine working at Bend right now. You have to get something new off the ground, greenlit, and into pre-production. They will likely go 10 years without releasing anything. If you're at Bluepoint, an even smaller team of fewer than 100 people, it could potentially be even more extreme. What Sony should have done is bought milk from a dozen sources, but not the cows. Work with Haven, Firewalk, and even Bungie, but don't buy them. Don't invest more than you need to. Similar to what Konami did several years ago when it publicly said, listen, we want external teams to work with us. Here are the IP we have available. We're also open to new ideas. Pitch us. Konami attracted major talent working on major games in that drive. Can you imagine what Sony could have done if they put themselves out there similarly, got into bed with some really knowledgeable brands and entities, and deployed them on games as a service? If they fail, who cares? It's money down the drain, but it isn't the time of other teams that can do other things. You've got to choose both paths, not one or the other. And hell, even when they stumbled upon a hit with Helldivers 2, a game in development for like 7 years built for reasons unknown on a completely defunct engine that's no longer supported, they botched what could have been with peculiar and often stupid decisions. And no, I'm not talking about the PSN login thing. Stop being a huge baby. Signing into PSN isn't the end of the world any more than I played Doom Eternal a few weeks back on my PS5 and had to make a Bethesda account to proceed. Rather, they, along with the developer Arrowhead, seemed insistent on fumbling the surprise meteoric success of Helldivers 2, misunderstanding and misinterpreting what was popular and beloved about it every step of the way. The game has recovered somewhat, but it'll never be what it could have been if more knowledgeable people were steering the ship. Turns out you don't need to make a PvE game harder for no reason whatsoever. Who could have thought? Many will point to other obvious deficiencies as key to Sony's games as a service initiative, and some of them are worth discussing, no doubt. A major one is IP allocation, with Sony seemingly fairly insistent on pursuing new franchises outside of reviving old classics. I actually don't hate this move either. Sony has frankly shown pretty good instincts over 30 years about what to continue and when to move on, but I think it would have made sense to have, say, a quarter of the 12 games in development hail from something known, something that a game's potential could be grounded in. People often throw around Resistance and Killzone, and out of those two, I think Killzone is the more obvious choice, but for me, a SOCOM game would have been a really good bet, competing with the likes of Rainbow Six Siege, but I digress. Whether you want a mascot brawler or some sort of hero-based shooter or whatever, it appears that Twisted Metal was the only legacy IP in play along with The Last of Us. Whether that was the right move or not will never truly be known, but when you're sitting on the likes of the games already mentioned, in addition to obscure stuff like Warhawk, PlayStation All-Stars, and even lesser known online products like MAG, Fat Princess, and whatever else, it seems hard to believe you don't try to revive any of it, instead handing Twisted Metal to the same studio that delivered Destruction All-Stars. You simply can't make it up.
Shut up and bleed, you motherfucker.
I feel like I'm going on and on at this point, so maybe it's time to wrap things up. It's a topic I've been thinking a great deal about, after all, and I've had so much to say. I guess where I want to leave things is in a place that won't be very popular with many people, but which represents how I truly feel nonetheless. For starters, Sony absolutely must have success in games as a service, and they'd be foolish to abandon course completely. What they need to do under new leadership is refine what they're trying to achieve, what deliverables they're looking for, and how they ultimately want to deploy potential products in a world full of Grand Theft Auto 5 and 6, in a world full of MMOs and service shooters and so much more, and on and on. There needs to be a compelling why beyond merely competing or trying to be present. They need to find the right ideas and marry them with the right teams and the right timelines, and they need to do that with second and third party relationships and not waste first party resources on experiences those teams aren't built to deliver on. I mean, for God's sake, Sony had Naughty Dog make a Last of Us online game for years, only to wake up one day and think, oh my god, if we release this thing, it will subsume our entire studio and we'll have to support it for years. Guys, that's something you figure out in greenlight meetings when you're fleshing out your schedule. It's not something you discover after spending hundreds of millions of dollars and the time and efforts of some of your most ferociously talented employees. No one thought any of this stuff through. It's a failure of execution, of planning, of reading the tea leaves. It's why I earnestly think that many people could run these entities better and make consistently better decisions, including me. But that's neither here nor there. And hey, if one of these second and third party games work out, great, scoop the team up and make it a first party team if necessary. That would have been Arrowhead in my mind if they just understood why people actually loved Helldivers 2 and didn't do so much to destroy their own momentum. But other potential products, partnerships, and marriages exist. And when Sony finds what works, you'll know about it because it'll be the talk of the industry. It's something they have to get right. They have no choice. It's a matter of doing things logically, with intention and foresight, that will help steer the ship to a more stable horizon. The only good news then is that Sony seems to be doing so well with PlayStation 5 that all of these losses, cancellations, and failures seem to matter so little in their trajectory towards 100 million consoles sold and beyond. It's like baking the perfect cake, and it tastes so good. It was all so well done, but where's the icing? Unfortunately, it's spoiled. Sony is truly lucky things lined up like this, but we as fans, well, we'll be waiting a long while yet to see how this truly pans out.